The gavel was set to fall, not with a crack of justice, but with the silent, soul-crushing thud of influence. In the hushed, mahogany-paneled courtroom, Cornelia Beaumont could feel the weight of $1 billion empire pressing down on her, suffocating her last ounce of hope. Her husband, Harrison Beaumont, the titan of Wall Street, sat impassive. His victory already reflected in the smug glint of his lawyer's eyes. The judge a man Harrison played golf with was clearing his throat to deliver a verdict that would leave her with nothing but shame. But a courtroom is a theater of surprises. And Cornelia was holding the script for the final devastating act, a tiny digital key that would unlock a monster from its cage and burn an Emma to the ground. The air in courtroom 28B of the New York County Supreme Court was thick with the scent of old wood, expensive perfume, and quiet desperation. It was the kind of manufactured stillness that precedes a storm. For 6 weeks, this room had been the arena for the brutal dissection of a marriage, a spectacle publicly known as Beaumont versus Beaumont. To the world, it was the messy, high-stakes divorce of Harrison and Cornelia Beaumont. To Cornelia, it was the final public execution of her life as she knew it. Harrison Beaumont sat at the plaintiff's table, a study in bespoke indifference. His suit, a tailored charcoal masterpiece by Zegna, probably cost more than the first car Cornelia ever owned. He wasn't just a man. He was an institution. As the founder and CEO of Beaumont Capital, his name was a verb on Wall Street to Beaumont. A company was to acquire it with surgical, ruthless precision. He exuded an aura of indomitable power, a gravitational field that bent wills and rewritten truths. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed, his jaw set, his gaze fixed not on his wife or the judge, but on a point somewhere in the middle distance, as if he were already contemplating his next quarterly earnings report. Beside him, Marcus Thorne Escool moved with the predatory grace of a panther. Thorne was a legend in the world of matrimonial law, known for reducing formidable opponents to weeping puddles of regret. His briefcase was alligator. His smile was wider. He had systematically painted Cornelia as a vindictive, unstable, and profligate, a woman who had enjoyed the fruits of Harrison's genius without ever contributing a single meaningful thing to their union. He had paraded a series of witnesses: a disgruntled former housekeeper, a society friend whose loyalty was bought and paid for, a psychologist who spoke in clinical, damning terms about Cornelia's emotional volatility, each one driving a nail into the coffin of her credibility. On the other side of the aisle sat Cornelia. She felt like a ghost haunting the scene of her own demise. She wore a simple navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the couture armor she used to don for galas and board dinners. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. Every so often her eyes would drift to Harrison, searching for a flicker of the man she had married 22 years ago, the ambitious but warm man who had quoted poetry to her in Central Park. She found nothing. In his place was this cold, polished effigy of success. Her lawyer, Chloe Sterling, was a fighter. Young, sharp, and fiercely dedicated, Chloe had been a relentless advocate for Cornelia, but she was outgunned and outmaneuvered at every turn. It was like bringing a finely crafted rapier to a tank battle. Thorne had a team of 20. Chloe had a paralegal and a mountain of debt. Every piece of evidence Chloe presented, Thorne would object to with a casual flick of his wrist. Every witness she called, he would dismantle on cross-examination with surgical contempt. The crux of the case was the prenuptial agreement. Signed when Harrison had more ambition than assets, it was by New York standards ironclad. It stipulated that in the event of a divorce, Cornelia would receive a one-time payment of $5 million. A pittance compared to the estimated $3.7 billion Harrison now commanded. The only way to break the prenup was to prove gross marital misconduct, specifically infidelity, backed by irrefutable evidence. They knew Harrison had been unfaithful. The whispers followed Cornelia everywhere, in the silent judgment of friends at the country club, in the thinly veiled pity of the other parents at their son's elite private school. The affair was with a younger woman, an art gallery curator named Calla Dubois. They had pictures, grainy long-lens shots of Harrison and Calla dining in a dimly lit corner of a restaurant, of them entering a discreet boutique hotel in Soho. But Thorne had masterfully neutralized every photo. Dining with a colleague, he'd explained away one. A business meeting, he'd dismissed another. Mr. Beaumont is a patron of the arts. Ms. Dubois is a respected figure in that world. Are we to criminalize professional association? He made it sound preposterous, even shameful to suggest anything sordid. Without a confession, without a photograph of a literal embrace, it was all just insinuation, and insinuation didn't break ironclad prenups. Now the final act was playing out. Judge Samuel Thompson, a man whose jowly face seemed permanently set in a look of weary impatience, peered down from his perch. Judge Thompson was a product of the old guard. He had known Harrison Beaumont socially for years. They were members of the same golf club, their names engraved on adjacent plaques in the club's hall of benefactors. While he maintained a facade of judicial impartiality, his bias had been a subtle, consistent undercurrent throughout the trial. He sustained Thorne's objections with a tired wave and overruled Chloe's with a sharp, cutting remark. "Have you presented all your evidence, Ms. Sterling?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice gravelly. He didn't look at Chloe, instead tidying a stack of papers that seemed of far greater importance. "Yes, Your Honor," Chloe said, her voice tight but unwavering. She shot a look at Cornelia, a silent apology. "I did everything I could." "Mr. Thorne, we rest Your Honor," Thorne said, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He gave Harrison a nearly imperceptible nod. The king was secure in his castle. Judge Thompson sighed, a theatrical display of a man burdened by the trivialities before him. "I have reviewed the evidence presented over the past 6 weeks. I have considered the testimony and the arguments of counsel." He adjusted his robes. This was it. The eulogy. The prenuptial agreement signed by both parties on May 12, 2003, is clear and unambiguous. The judge began, his words falling like stones into the silent room. The standard to invalidate such a document is exceedingly high. While counsel for the defendant has attempted to paint a picture of marital misconduct, the evidence has been circumstantial at best. Cornelia felt the blood drain from her face. The courtroom began to feel distant, the sounds muffled as if she were underwater. She could see their son Julian sitting in the first row of the public gallery. At 17, he was a handsome, conflicted echo of his father. Throughout the trial, he had been Harrison's staunchest defender. His eyes, whenever they met Cornelia's, filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Harrison had convinced him this was all his mother's fault, a greedy cash grab. Seeing him there, believing the lie was the cruelest cut of all. The photographs presented do not meet the evidentiary threshold for infidelity. The judge continued, his voice droning on. The defendant's claims of emotional distress, while perhaps genuine, do not rise to the level of duress required to set aside a legally binding contract. The agreement was entered into willingly, with both parties represented by competent counsel. Competent counsel. Cornelia's lawyer back then had been a family friend of Harrison's, a man who had told her the prenup was just a formality. Therefore, Judge Thompson said, lifting the gavel slightly, it is the finding of this court that the prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. The petition to have it set aside is denied. The terms will stand as written. Mr. Beaumont will pay the defendant the sum of $5 million as a final settlement. All other claims are dismissed. A gasp, small and stifled, escaped Cornelia's lips. $5 million? It sounded like a fortune, but it was an insult. It was the price of 22 years of her life, of raising their son, of managing their homes, of hosting the endless parade of business partners and political figures who had helped build Harrison's empire. It was the price of her silence, her loyalty, her complicity. It was nothing. It was walking away with less than the value of the jewelry Harrison had in his safe. Marcus Thorne leaned back in his chair, the picture of satisfaction. Harrison remained motionless, his expression unchanged. He hadn't won. He had merely confirmed the foregone conclusion. The universe had proceeded as he expected it to. Judge Thompson was about to bring the gavel down. The sound would be the punctuation mark at the end of her life's longest, most painful chapter. Her world was shrinking to the point of a pin, a single sharp point of utter despair. It was in that pinprick of silence, in that breath, before the final crushing blow, that Cornelia Beaumont found the last ember of her strength. She had held on to one thing, a desperate last-ditch contingency she had prayed she would not have to use. A secret she had guarded for 3 agonizing weeks. Her hand, no longer trembling, reached into the designer handbag at her feet. It was the bag Harrison had bought her for their last anniversary. A cruel irony. Her fingers closed around a small, cold object. A USB flash drive. "Your Honor," a voice said, cutting through the silence. The voice was clear, calm, and resonant. It took a moment for everyone, including Cornelia herself, to realize it was hers. Judge Thompson paused, his gavel hovering mid-air. He looked down at her, his annoyance palpable. "Mrs. Beaumont, this proceeding is concluded. You will be silent, or I will have you removed." "Your Honor," Cornelia said, again rising to her feet. Her chair scraped against the floor, a jarring, ugly sound in the sanctified quiet. Chloe Sterling was on her feet beside her hand on her arm, her face a mask of confusion and alarm. "Cornelia, what are you doing?" Chloe whispered urgently. Cornelia ignored her. Her eyes were locked on Judge Thompson, but her words were aimed like a weapon across the aisle. "Before you deliver your final ruling, there is one last piece of evidence you need to see." Marcus Thorne scoffed a short, barking laugh. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. The discovery phase has been closed for months. Evidence has been presented. You have made your ruling." "I haven't brought the gavel down yet, Mr. Thorne." The judge grumbled, his irritation warring with a flicker of curiosity. "What is this, Mrs. Beaumont? Some kind of stunt?" "It's a video, Your Honor," Cornelia said, her voice gaining strength with every word. She held up the small flash drive between her thumb and forefinger. It glinted under the courtroom lights. "And I believe it has direct bearing on the matter of marital misconduct." Harrison, for the first time, shifted in his seat. A subtle, almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. He looked at Cornelia, truly looked at her, and for a split second she saw not indifference, but a flash of cold, calculating appraisal. He was running the odds, assessing the threat. "This is an absolute farce," Thorne boomed, rising to his full height. "She has had ample opportunity to present evidence. This is a desperate theatrical attempt to derail these proceedings. It is inadmissible. It is a flagrant violation of every rule of civil procedure." "What is on the drive, Mrs. Beaumont?" Judge Thompson asked, his gaze narrowed on the tiny object in her hand. "A conversation," Cornelia replied, her heart now hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a wild, terrifying surge of power. "A conversation between my husband and his mistress, Calla Dubois." The name hung in the air, no longer a whispered insinuation, but a stark fact. Harrison's face remained a mask, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. Julian in the gallery leaned forward, his face a canvas of confusion. "Objection. Unsubstantiated. Foundation. Hearsay." Thorne rattled off the objections like a machine gun. "Your Honor," Chloe Sterling suddenly chimed in, recovering from her shock and seeing the opening. "My client is making a serious claim. If this evidence is as pivotal as she suggests, to ignore it would be a miscarriage of justice. We ask the court for permission to play the video." The courtroom was murmuring now, a low hum of anticipation. Reporters in the back were already scribbling furiously. This was no longer a boring conclusion. This was a climax. Judge Thompson looked from Cornelia's defiant face to Harrison's stony one. His loyalty to his golf partner was being weighed against the integrity of his courtroom right here in the open. To refuse would look like a cover-up. He let out a long, suffering sigh. "This is highly irregular, Ms. Sterling. Highly irregular." He glared at Cornelia. "This had better be substantive, Mrs. Beaumont, or I will hold you in contempt." He looked at the court clerk. "Do we have the facilities to play a video from a thumb drive?" "Yes, Your Honor. We can project it onto the main screen." "Very well," the judge said, his voice laced with venom. "Let's see what Mrs. Beaumont thinks is so important that she feels she can hijack a superior court proceeding." He slammed the gavel down once, not to end the case, but to demand silence. "Let's play the video." Chloe took the drive from Cornelia's hand, her eyes asking 1,000 questions Cornelia couldn't answer. She gave a small, reassuring nod. A court officer took the drive and inserted it into a port on the clerk's desk. The large white screen on the wall, which had been displaying diagrams of financial assets, flickered to life. Harrison Beaumont leaned forward and whispered something to Marcus Thorne. Thorne nodded grimly. Harrison then leaned back, crossed his arms and fixed his eyes on the screen, a look of bored contempt on his face. He was preparing to dismiss it, to call it a fake, a deep fake, a clever edit. He had built an empire on the bedrock of his own invincibility. He couldn't conceive of a world where it could be any other way. Cornelia Beaumont stood, her body trembling slightly, but her spirit resolute. She thought of the moment she had received the anonymous envelope 3 weeks ago, the terror and sickness she had felt watching the video for the first time on her laptop, the screen illuminating her tear-streaked face in the dead of night. She had wrestled with what to do, terrified of Harrison's wrath, of the public humiliation. But the judge's dismissive tone, Harrison's cold indifference, Julian's accusing eyes, they had forged her fear into a weapon. The screen flickered from blue to black, and then an image appeared. The entire courtroom held its breath. The image that materialized on the large courtroom screen was jarringly intimate. It wasn't a grainy spy cam shot. The quality was crisp, the audio sharp. The setting was a luxurious, sun-drenched living room, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking what was unmistakably the Amalfi Coast. It was the living room of Villa Amara, the cliffside estate Harrison had leased for the month of August, a trip he had claimed was a solo digital detox to clear his head. On a plush white sofa, Harrison Beaumont sat not in a suit, but in a linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked relaxed, unguarded, a version of himself Cornelia hadn't seen in years. He was holding a glass of amber liquid ice, clinking softly as he swirled it. And beside him, curled with one leg tucked under her, was Calla Dubois. She was beautiful, undeniably so, with a cascade of dark hair and an artist's intense eyes. She wore a simple white sundress that seemed to amplify the golden tan of her skin. The camera was positioned from a low angle, perhaps on a coffee table or a bookshelf, slightly obscured by a vase of vibrant bougainvillea. It was clear this was not a public sighting. It was a private moment, secretly recorded. The courtroom was utterly silent, the only sound the faint hum of the projector. Harrison at the plaintiff's table went rigid. His carefully constructed mask of indifference didn't crack. It shattered. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy pale sheen. He stared at his own image on the screen, a look of pure, unadulterated shock in his eyes. He slowly turned his head to look at Cornelia, and the gaze that met hers was no longer cold or appraising. It was murderous. Marcus Thorne looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. His mouth was slightly agape, his confident posture collapsing in on itself. He was running through a Rolodex of legal objections, but they were all useless. The man he had spent 6 weeks defending as a maligned husband was on a 10-foot screen, looking very much not maligned. On the screen, Calla laughed a light musical sound. "You look so serious, Ally." Her voice filled the courtroom, clear as a bell. "What are you thinking about Harrison on the screen?" The relaxed vacationing. Harrison took a slow sip of his drink. He stared out at the azure sea. Just the board meeting next week. And Cornelia. The mention of her name sent a jolt through Cornelia. She felt Julian stiffen beside her in the gallery. Calla traced a finger along his arm. Forget about Cornelia. She's all the way back in New York, probably planning a charity luncheon. The condescension in her tone was a physical blow. "When are you finally going to tell her?" "You promised." Harrison sighed, a sound of deep, world-weary frustration. "It's not that simple, Calla. You don't just end a 22-year marriage, especially not with a woman like Cornelia." "What does that mean, a woman like Cornelia?" Calla's voice was sharper now. This was the moment. The reason Cornelia had held this back. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the truth that underpinned it. Harrison on the screen leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, intimate tone. "Cornelia is a fixture. She's part of the brand, the graceful, supportive wife. It's a role she plays perfectly, and it's a role that's been very, very good for business. You don't just fire your best asset." Chloe Sterling drew in a sharp breath. This was better than a simple confession of infidelity. This was a confession of motive, of the cold, calculated utility of his marriage. Calla on the screen looked unconvinced. "So I'm just supposed to wait in the shadows forever?" "That wasn't the deal, Harrison. You said you loved me. You said she meant nothing to you." Harrison put his glass down and turned to face her. Taking her hands in his expression was earnest, persuasive, the same expression he used to close a multi-billion-dollar deal. "Of course I love you," he said, his voice a velvet murmur. "You're everything to me. But you have to understand the mechanics of my world. The divorce has to be on my terms. The prenup is ironclad. I've made sure of that. My lawyer Thorne, he'll paint her as unhinged. We'll leak a few stories, create a narrative. In the end, she'll be lucky to walk away with the settlement." Marcus Thorne in the courtroom sank lower in his chair, his face turning a shade of crimson. He was being discussed by his own client on tape as a pawn in a scheme to defraud the court. Judge Thompson was no longer looking impatient. He was transfixed, his mouth a thin, hard line. The casual mention of manipulating the legal process, a process he was presiding over, had wiped all traces of old boys' club camaraderie from his face. "And the $5 million from the prenup?" Calla asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Harrison laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated arrogance. $5 million is what I spend on art to avoid paying taxes," he scoffed. The camera angle caught the cruel smirk on his face. "It's a rounding error. But listen, and listen carefully. This is important." He leaned closer still, his voice dropping even further, forcing the entire courtroom to strain to hear. "The real money, the serious money, isn't even on the books. Half of Beaumont Capital's growth in the last quarter came from the offshore holding company in the Caymans. The charitable foundation we set up last year. It's a wash. We move assets through it clean as a whistle. Cornelia's name isn't on any of it. My lawyers have made sure my entire financial empire is a ghost to her and to the IRS. So when I say she'll get nothing, I mean nothing of what's real." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. This was no longer a divorce proceeding. This had just crossed the line into a confession of massive financial fraud. Chloe Sterling's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at Cornelia, who stood like a statue, her face pale, but resolute. Cornelia hadn't just brought a knife to a gunfight. She had brought a nuclear bomb. On the screen, Harrison stroked Calla's cheek. "So you see, I have to manage my exit from this marriage carefully. It's a business transaction. Once I'm clear of her, and the dust settles you and I can be together. Properly. But you have to be patient. You have to trust me. And what if I don't?" Calla's voice was quiet, but it held a new steely edge. Harrison's smile faded. His eyes went cold. The charm evaporated, replaced by the predator Cornelia knew all too well. "Then you'll find that I am a very, very bad enemy to have," he said softly. "You're a smart girl, Calla. Don't be a foolish one." The video ended. The screen went black. For a full 10 seconds, the courtroom was plunged into a silence so profound it was deafening. It was a vacuum where every single person was processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The confession of the affair was the smallest part of it. The casual admission of perjury witness, tampering tax evasion, and offshore fraud, all delivered with the smug certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable. It was a symphony of self-destruction. Then chaos erupted. The reporters in the back scrambled for the doors, fingers flying across their phones, desperate to be the first to break the story. Shouts echoed in the chamber. "Order, order in this court!" Judge Thompson bellowed, banging his gavel repeatedly, the sound now sharp and frantic. Marcus Thorne was on his feet, his face ashen. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. This video is unverified. It could be doctored. It's an illegal recording, a violation of privacy. It is completely inadmissible." But his protests were hollow, drowned out by the gravity of the moment. Everyone in the room knew they had seen the truth. Harrison Beaumont did not move. He was staring at the blank screen, but his focus was turned inward. He was a master strategist, a man who saw every angle and for the first time in his life, he had been completely and utterly blindsided. He slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto Cornelia's across the room. The hatred in them was pure, distilled, and terrifying. If looks could kill, she would have been reduced to ashes on the courtroom floor. But Cornelia did not flinch. For the first time in 2 decades, she felt no fear of him. She had taken his greatest weapon, his power, his belief in his own invincibility, and used it to slit his throat. Then a new sound cut through the din. A choked sob. It came from the gallery. Julian Beaumont was on his feet, his face a mess of tears and confusion. His hero, the father he idolized, the man who had convinced him his mother was the villain, had just confessed to everything and more. The world he knew, the father he loved, had been a lie. He looked from the screen to his father, then to his mother, his expression one of utter devastation. "Dad," he choked out the word barely audible. Harrison didn't even look at him. His entire world had narrowed to the woman who had just destroyed him. Judge Thompson's face was a thundercloud. The implicit insult to his court, the confession of crimes that made the divorce squabble seem trivial, had transformed him. The Good Old Boy network was officially closed. "Mr. Thorne, you will be silent, or I will have you held in contempt alongside your client," he thundered, his voice shaking with rage. He glared at Harrison with newfound contempt. "Mr. Beaumont, your cavalier discussion of manipulating this court is the most egregious display of hubris I have ever witnessed." He then turned his gaze to Cornelia, and for the first time he looked at her with something approaching respect. "Mrs. Beaumont, where did you obtain this video?" "It was sent to me anonymously, Your Honor," Cornelia said, her voice steady. "We demand a forensic analysis. We demand proof of chain of custody," Thorne shouted, grasping at straws. "You'll get your chance for that, Mr. Thorne," the judge snapped back. "Perhaps in the criminal proceedings that are likely to follow." He paused, looking around the chaotic room. He took a deep breath, his decision made. "In light of this new evidence," he said, the words dripping with understatement, "my previous ruling is vacated." A collective gasp. It is clear to this court that gross marital misconduct has not only occurred, but that the plaintiff, Mr. Beaumont, has acted in egregious bad faith, perjured himself, and conspired to defraud both his wife and this court. Therefore, the prenuptial agreement is hereby set aside in its entirety. Cornelia felt her knees go weak. Chloe grabbed her arm to steady her, her own face a picture of stunned victory. "The division of marital assets will be reassessed," the judge declared, his voice booming with authority. "And given Mr. Beaumont's admitted efforts to conceal assets, I am ordering an immediate court-appointed forensic audit of all of Mr. Beaumont's personal and corporate finances, both domestic and international. All assets of Beaumont Capital are hereby frozen pending review." Harrison flinched as if he'd been shot. Frozen. The word was a death sentence. "This court is adjourned." Judge Thompson slammed the gavel down, the crack echoing like a gunshot. "And I would advise Mr. Beaumont not to make any travel plans." It was over, but it was also just the beginning. The courtroom doors burst open, and a wall of flashing lights and shouting reporters flooded the hallway. The Beaumonts, once a dynasty, were now just a story, the biggest, ugliest story in a decade. And Cornelia stood in the eye of the hurricane she had created a victor in a war she never wanted to fight. The explosion in courtroom 28B sent shockwaves that traveled at the speed of light. Before Cornelia could even process the judge's final words, the room devolved into a maelstrom. Court officers formed a protective line, but the media frenzy was a force of nature. The sound was a physical wall of shouted questions, clicking cameras, and the blinding strobe of flash photography. Cornelia this way. Chloe Sterling, no longer a timid lawyer, but a warrior who had just witnessed a miracle, grabbed her client's arm and forged a path towards a side door. They were jostled and pushed, a sea of microphones thrust into Cornelia's tall, tearful face. "Mrs. Beaumont, how did you get the video? Was it Cala Dubois who sent it? What's your reaction to your husband's assets being frozen?" Cornelia. She kept her head down, her world a blur of motion and noise. The questions were meaningless static. Her mind was still back in that silent moment when the video went black, the moment she saw the look of pure, unadulterated hatred in Harrison's eyes. That was real. This chaos was just the consequence. They burst through a heavy wooden door into a private corridor, the sounds of the media horde instantly muffled. Cornelia leaned against the cool marble wall, her legs finally giving way to a tremor she could no longer control. "We did it," Chloe breathed, her face flushed with adrenaline and disbelief. "My God, Cornelia, we did it. I've never seen anything like it. You didn't just win. You annihilated him." Cornelia gave a weak, hollow laugh. "It doesn't feel like winning." Her eyes drifted toward the main corridor, where she could see Harrison surrounded by his own phalanx of security and a frantic Marcus Thorne being swallowed by the press. But it was the image of her son that haunted her. She had seen Julian stumble out of the gallery in the initial chaos. His face ashen, his eyes lost. He hadn't looked at her. He had simply fled. She had destroyed his father in front of his eyes, and in doing so, she feared she had severed the bond between them forever. "I have to find Julian," she whispered. "Your security is waiting downstairs," Chloe said, her tone shifting to one of protective concern. "We need to get you out of here. We can find Julian once you're safe." Safe. It was a word that had lost all meaning. She had detonated a bomb in the middle of her life. There was no safe in the blast radius. Meanwhile, in a black town car, speeding away from the courthouse, Harrison Beaumont was a cold animal. He had ripped off his tie and thrown it on the floor. His face, usually so controlled, was a mask of cold fury. "What the hell was that, Marcus?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Marcus Thorne, looking 10 years older than he had an hour ago, wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. Harrison. I had no idea. How could I know she had something like that? It must have been an illegal recording. We can fight it on those grounds. We can appeal. Harrison turned to him with a look of such venom that Thorne physically recoiled. "Appeal, appeal!" he roared, his voice filling the car. "Did you not hear the judge? My assets are frozen. The SEC will be crawling up my colon by lunchtime. The IRS will be sending a goddamn army. My company's stock is probably already in free fall. An appeal won't stop the bleeding." She didn't just wound me, Marcus. She shot me in the head. In public, he slammed his fist against the leather seat. "Cala!" He hissed the name like a curse. It had to be her. No one else could have recorded that. His mind was racing not with fear, but with a cold, strategic rage. He was already shifting from damage control to retribution. "Find her, Marcus," he commanded. "I don't care what it takes. Private investigators, surveillance, whatever you need. Find out who she's talking to. Find out everything, and get a team on this video. I want to know how it got from her to Cornelia. I want every link in that chain." "And what about Cornelia?" Thorne asked tentatively. Harrison stared out the window at the blurred cityscape of Manhattan, the empire he had built. "Cornelia," he said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Cornelia will learn what it truly means to be my enemy." The source of the earthquake. Cala Dubois was miles away, sitting in a Spartan sunlit apartment in Brooklyn. The television was on a cable news channel, playing the chaotic scenes from the courthouse on a loop, the volume muted. A half-packed suitcase lay open on her bed. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly for the last hour, a relentless stream of calls and texts from reporters, friends, and most ominously, numbers she didn't recognize. She ignored them all. There was no triumph on her face, no satisfaction, only a profound, weary sadness and fear. She had wrestled with the decision for months. The video had been her insurance policy recorded on a whim after Harrison had made a particularly chilling threat disguised as a lover's promise. He had promised her the world, but his promises were built on a foundation of lies and cruelty. She had seen firsthand how he treated people he considered disposable. She had been his beautiful distraction, but she was starting to feel like his next liability. The final straw had come 2 months ago. A missed period, a positive test, and a conversation with Harrison that had stripped away any lingering illusions she had about him. When she told him she was pregnant, his charm had vanished instantly. He had offered her money, a lot of money, enough to take care of the problem and disappear. He had been clear a child was not part of his carefully managed exit strategy. It was then she understood. To him, she and their unborn child were just another asset to be liquidated. So she had made her own exit strategy. She couldn't go to the police. Harrison's reach was too long. She couldn't fight him in court. She had no resources. But she could give the one person with the standing to fight him the weapon she needed, using a burner phone and a complex series of encrypted emails to ensure her anonymity. She had arranged for the flash drive to be delivered to a post office box she had set up for Cornelia under a false name. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. She had no idea if Cornelia would use it or how. Now, watching the news, she knew. She had given Cornelia the power to burn Harrison's kingdom down. But Cala knew Harrison. The fire would not stop with him. He would search for the source for the person who had betrayed him. And when he found her, his vengeance would be swift and terrible. Her hand went to her still flat stomach. She wasn't just running for herself anymore. She picked up her phone, took a deep breath, and made a call. "It's done," she said when a voice answered. "I'm on my way. I'll see you at the rendezvous point." She hung up, deleted the call log, and placed the phone on the counter. She walked over to the window that looked out onto the street. A black sedan was parked across the road. It hadn't been there an hour ago. Her time was up. Leaving the phone and most of her belongings behind, she grabbed the suitcase, slung a purse over her shoulder, and slipped out the back entrance of the apartment building into a grimy alleyway, melting into the anonymous afternoon crowds of the city. A ghost haunted by the billionaire she had helped to create and then to destroy. That evening, Cornelia was holed up in a suite at the Carlisle Hotel, a place chosen by Chloe for its legendary discretion. The city buzzed with her name. Her face was on every screen, but inside the suite there was only a heavy silence. Chloe had finally left after fielding a barrage of calls, including one from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, who were very interested in speaking with Mrs. Beaumont. Cornelia hadn't eaten. She had been trying to reach Julian for hours, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She had called the school his friends, his girlfriend. No one had seen him since he fled the courthouse. A cold knot of dread was tightening in her stomach. Just after 9 p.m., there was a soft knock on the door. Thinking it was room service she hadn't ordered, she opened it to find Julian standing there. He looked broken. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, his school blazer rumpled. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the plush carpet. "Julian!" She breathed relief washing over her, so intensely she felt dizzy. She reached for him, but he flinched away from her touch. "I went to see him," Julian said, his voice hoarse. "At his office. I had to hear him say it. I had to hear his side." Cornelia's heart sank. "Oh, Julian, he told me," Julian continued, finally looking up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "He told me the video was fake. A deep fake, he called it. He said you and some tech wizard cooked it up to extort him. He said you were a liar and a thief. You don't believe that, do you?" she asked softly. Julian shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "I wanted to. For a minute I almost did. He was so convincing. My father, you know." He let out a bitter, joyless laugh. "But then I saw his eyes. He wasn't sad or hurt. He was just angry. Angry that he got caught." He finally walked into the room and collapsed onto an armchair. "Everything he said, about the money, about you, calling you an asset, was that real?" Cornelia sat on the ottoman opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap. She owed him the truth. All of it. "Yes," she said quietly. "All of it." For a long time, Julian just stared into space, processing the complete demolition of his childhood reality. The powerful, brilliant father he worshipped was a fraud. The cold, distant mother he had resented was the one telling the truth. "The news," he said finally. "They're calling it the Beaumont implosion. They said Beaumont Capital stock dropped 60% before they halted trading. They're saying he could go to prison. For a long time." "I know," Cornelia whispered. Julian looked at her, his expression a complex mixture of anger, hurt, and a dawning, reluctant understanding. "Why, Mum? Why did you do it like that? In front of everyone, in front of me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. It was the question she had been asking herself all day. "Because he left me no other choice," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of years of silent suffering. "Your father, he built a fortress around himself, Julian. A fortress of lawyers and money and power. I couldn't get through the walls. I couldn't make anyone listen. The only way to get to the truth was to use a weapon he couldn't defend against his own voice, his own arrogance." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading with him to understand. This wasn't just about the money. It was about 22 years of being made to feel small, of being told my thoughts and feelings didn't matter. It was about him trying to take you away from me by poisoning you with his lies. I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it to save myself, and in a way to save you too. From him." Julian didn't respond. He just sat there, the heir to a fallen empire, a boy caught in the rubble of his parents' war. Cornelia had won the battle, but she looked at her son's shattered face and realized the war was far from over. The casualties were still being counted. The days following the courtroom detonation were a maelstrom. The Beaumont implosion became the media's shorthand for Harrison's spectacular fall. His face, a scowling, paparazzi-shot visage, was everywhere. The video of his confession became a viral sensation, his boast about tax evasion an infamous meme. The consequences were swift. The U.S. attorney unsealed a criminal complaint, the SEC filed a civil suit, and Beaumont Capital, his life's work, was gutted. The board forced his resignation, and Harrison, once the king of Manhattan, became a prisoner in his penthouse, his empire reduced to rubble. For Cornelia, victory was a strange, disorienting country. On paper, she was powerful, celebrated. The court had awarded her a staggering fortune, and women on the street offered quiet congratulations. Yet her new life felt hollow. She was a victor, living in a gilded cage at the Carlyle, hounded by reporters and opportunistic bankers. The deepest wound was Julian. He stayed with her, a silent, brooding presence, a ghost moving through the opulent suite. He had withdrawn from his life, and Cornelia feared her victory had cost her son his innocence forever. One evening, Chloe Sterling arrived, her briefcase bulging. "The forensic team is making progress," she said, her tone grim. "The offshore accounts are a labyrinth, but Harrison's greed was his undoing. He kept meticulous records. We'll get it all." She paused, her expression hardening. "He knows Calla was the source. His PIs tracked the burner phone trail. Marcus Thorne is filing motions to have the video thrown out, claiming illegal recording and extortion. It won't work, but it shows where Harrison's head is. He isn't thinking about his defense. He's thinking about revenge." That night, Chloe's words became terrifyingly real. A call from hotel security jolted Cornelia from a restless sleep. A man posing as a pizza delivery driver had been caught trying to access her floor. He wasn't carrying pizza. He was carrying a professional-grade listening device. Harrison, stripped of his legal power, was resorting to shadows and spies. The fear a low hum for days sharpened into cold resolve. Cornelia was done hiding. The next day, she checked out of the Carlyle. In a move that shocked her friends, she moved back into the Fifth Avenue penthouse she had shared with Harrison, a property now legally hers. It was a reclamation of her territory. She hired her own security team, a group of ex-Mossad agents, and made a call to a discreet investigator of her own. If Harrison wanted a war in the dark, she would learn to see. A month passed. Harrison was out on a $10 million bond confined to his home with an ankle monitor. The fragile truce between Cornelia and Julian held until one rainy afternoon when Julian entered the library where she was working. "I spoke to him today," he said, his voice flat. Cornelia put down her papers. "How is he?" "He sounds smaller," Julian said, searching for the word. "He asked me to come live with him. He said, 'You've taken everything, and now you're trying to take me.' He told me he was the victim." Cornelia fought back a surge of anger. "What did you tell him?" Julian met her gaze, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. "I told him he was a liar. I told him he didn't lose his family. He threw it away." His voice cracked. "And I told him not to call me again." Tears welled in Cornelia's eyes. It was a moment not of triumph, but of profound shared sorrow. The son she feared she had lost had finally found his own way to the truth. He crossed the room, and for the first time since the trial, hugged her tightly. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, "for not believing you. I'm sorry you had to go through this." She wept, holding on to him. In that moment of fragile peace, her private phone rang. It was the investigator. "We found her." the man's voice said, clipped and professional. Cala Dubois. She's in a small town in Quebec. She's had a baby. A boy. Harrison's son. The news landed with the force of a physical blow. There's more, the investigator continued. We tracked the source of her escape fund, the logistics, the encrypted money transfers. It wasn't her doing. The payments originated from a firewalled trust controlled by your husband's mother, Meredith Beaumont. Cornelia sank into a chair, stunned. Meredith, the family's iron-willed matriarch, had always despised her. But she revered Harrison. Why help the woman who caused his downfall? The answer was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Meredith's loyalty was not to her son, but to the Beaumont bloodline. She had helped Cala disappear, not to spite Harrison, but to protect his heir, the illegitimate child he had tried to erase. Cornelia finally understood the full scope of the game. It was never just about a marriage. It was about a dynasty. Harrison, cornered and facing prison, was still hunting for Cala, desperate to silence the last witness. And now Cornelia held the map. She looked at Julian, her own son, whose future she had fought to secure. The war wasn't over. She had fought to save herself. Now she had to fight to protect a woman she'd never met and the innocent child caught in the crossfire. "Get the jet ready," she said to her head of security, her voice calm and resolute. "I'm going to Canada." The empire was in ruins, but the battle for the future of the Beaumont family had just begun. In the end, it wasn't just about a single video or a courtroom victory. It was about the slow, deliberate dismantling of a toxic legacy. Cornelia Beaumont, armed with the truth and a newfound strength, did more than just win her freedom. She rewrote the future. By protecting Cala and her infant son from Harrison's reach, she drew a line in the sand, choosing compassion over the cycle of revenge that had defined the Beaumont name. Harrison's conviction, a landmark case built on his own recorded arrogance, was a public reckoning. But the private victory was quieter. A son who finally saw his mother's strength, and a woman who discovered her own power, was not in the fortune she won, but in the choices she made after. The story of Beaumont Ver. Beaumont became a legend, a cautionary tale of how quickly empires can fall and a testament to the fact that sometimes the most powerful truth comes from the quietest voice. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of drama, betrayal, and ultimate justice. If you were on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you think was the most cunning character in this saga? Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a story of truth against power. And most importantly, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss another real-life drama that's more compelling than fiction. We'll see you in the next video.